The occurrence border spent the next few days being as still and quiet as it possibly could. Meanwhile, everyone inside it ran around in frenzy of preparation that put our earlier efforts to shame. None of it was directed towards improving the zoanthrope containment area anymore, though. Instead, it was all focused on keeping us alive long enough to capture the bloody thing. Armsmen drilled on repelling borders. The ship's lances were brought up to as close to functional as they'd ever been, and Tink finished getting everyone equipped with pulse weapons while Theo put the final touches on Spot 2.0. The rest of us trained with our new weapons and kept Twitch from doing anything crazier than usual. On the third day, we were all called up to the bridge by the captain. Well, only Sarge and the Adepts were called, but the rest of us were tired of all the horrible waiting. A very brief message telling us to hold our position and wait for secure comm contact was replayed for us. The captain told us he hadn't seen any other vessels enter the system and didn't even have a hard source for the comm message. Just a vague direction. That was rather disturbing, but no one except Twitch could figure out a way it could be a trap. The captain and Sarge decided to wait and see what happened next. After half an hour, another message came in. An incredibly deep voice that practically screamed Space Marine identified itself as Sergeant Gravis of the Emperor's Scythes, and instructed us to lower our shields so he could dock. As the captain did so, Sarge squared his shoulders and picked up the Vox's handset, only to have the officer manning it tell him that we still didn't have a target for a secure channel. The man asked Sarge if he should just broadcast generally, and Sarge agreed. He got about halfway through introducing himself before the Marine voxed back, and told him to cease broadcasting before he alerted the whole system. Sarge sheepishly hung up the vox and vented some frustration by asking the communications officers what he meant by still didn't have a target. It was quickly revealed that sensors still hadn't detected the Marine's ship, despite it being close enough to worry about docking. The sensor techs claimed that the incoming ship must be shuttle-sized and have some good stealth systems, but they were sure to spot it when it requested final docking instructions. Tink, not very quietly, suggested that instead of the Marine's ship being very stealthy, the tech's systems were just complete shit. He then volunteered to have them upgraded to modern standards after the mission. The ensuing argument was brought to a halt by the Marine voxing back and telling us to reactivate our shields and close the shuttle bay doors. While most of us laughed at the sensor techs for not spotting a ship before it landed on us, Doc raised the question of where the Marines had landed. We hadn't actually opened the bays yet. Unsurprisingly, given that they were the ones who'd patrolled the ship the most, Nubby and Twitch figured it out first. Both troopers screamed at Sarge to stop the Marine. Sarge and the captain both caught on to what had happened at the same moment that the techs pinpointed the Marine's ship in the foremost bay on the top of the occurrence border. The one in the badly warp-tainted area near the prow, which was left open and airless at all times, and was never to be used. The two normally stoic men frantically ran towards the communications officer and screamed at him to open a channel. In the background, a confused-sounding comm came in from the Marine, asking why everything was so green and why there was a crewman without a void suit in the airless bay. Sarge won the sprint and had the vox halfway to his mouth when the Marine's confused questions changed to reports of incoming hostiles. Despite everything that happened afterwards, Sarge's reaction was about as perfect as was possible. In his best non-comm voice, he bellowed at the Marine to disengage and pull his shuttle out of the bay. I'm not sure if you're familiar with how big and loud a Space Marine's voice is, but overriding one via pure volume and vitriol is a feat worthy of legend. Every time the Marine tried to argue, or ask for clarification, Sarge just shouted over him in that parade ground voice he'd spent his life practicing. It was working, and everything might have turned out fine, if there hadn't been a second Marine, that is. The other Astartes, who'd been spared the full brunt of Sarge's wrath, cut in and asked his battle brother if he'd tarnish the chapter's honor by running like a squad of guardsmen without a commissar. The first Marine rallied and announced his intention to enter the bay and deal with the hostiles that were evading his shuttle's weapons. Sarge switched tactics and frantically tried to explain that there weren't any enemies, and opening the airlock would let the warp fungus in, but dissolved into furious cursing when he heard the shuttle's lock cycle. With a final growl of, "This isn't a battle, you idiot! It is sanitation! You're going to get yourself killed fighting fungus!" he handed the Vox unit over to Doc and the Adepts. Doc and everyone else with more charisma than a dead Felid slowly explained the situation to the Marine that hadn't just contaminated himself. The rest of us stood there and listened to the sound of a Space Marine trying to kill Xenos that miraculously seemed to dodge every shot. Nubby and Amy started placing bets on how long it would be before the warp fungus, as we called it, ate through the Marine's power armor, and whether the Marine would even be able to notice. No one gave him good odds. We all knew just how nasty the warp fungus could get. Hell, it had been some of us who'd first discovered this stuff. Standard operating procedures on the occurrence border was to just seal off any warp-tainted sections with nothing important inside. The lack of anything living to mess with kept the number of manifestations to a minimum, and anything that did appear usually faded before it could claw through the sealed bulkheads. Occasionally, though, something nastier than usual would appear and need dealing with. Nubby, Twitch, Fumbles, and recently Amy spent a lot of time watching for signs of this sort of stuff, and often got stuck with the job of fixing it. Anyway, the warp fungus was one of those nastier than usual things, but fixing it had been a bit of a problem. Fumbles had sort of heard it in the tainted shuttle bay months ago, back before we reached the Tau border worlds, in fact. He'd made such a fuss about the psychic noise it was emitting that Nubby and Twitch had agreed to risk a recon mission into the bay between warp jumps. They'd run in and pinpointed a large container labeled Potato Substitute, 15 tons, as the source of the noise. Because they were relatively savvy to how this sort of thing worked, they'd declined to actually open the container, and just solve the problem in the same way they'd solved most of the others. Which is to say, they covered it with det packs. At the time, they'd declared victory when the explosion went off and the psychic noise stopped. But in retrospect, that had only served to spread the fungus all over the bay. While the noise hadn't returned, patrolling armsmen began reporting strange sounds, then disappearing. And then other armsmen reported hearing or seeing the missing ones. Over a dozen had vanished into the bay before Nubby and the rest took a second look. They'd found it covered with the fungus, which was in the process of dissolving everything less sturdy than the bay's blast-proof outer doors and walls. Also, it was filled with the missing armsmen, who were beckoning them inwards. Nubby, Fumbles, and Twitch had immediately shut the door and ran for it. As they'd fled, a horde of orcs, gene stealers, and a few other varieties of Xenos appeared at the end of the hall and blocked their escape. Fortunately, Fumbles was along and realized that the new enemies were some sort of psychic illusion. The Psyker was able to dispel the illusion without anything more serious than a temporal reversal of gravity happening, and the debatably heroic trio escaped. There'd been a few attempts to kill off the warp fungus after that. Unfortunately, between its caustic nature, the hallucinations, and the fact that it was hellishly hard to kill, all that was accomplished was getting a few more armsmen and a whole lot of servitors melted. Eventually, someone suggested just voiding the bay, then leaving it open until the stuff died. That didn't work, but it did cause the stuff to go dormant unless something ventured into the bay. Since we didn't actually use the bay for anything, the captain had decided that the problem was no longer pressing, and we'd gotten back on our way. As a precaution, Old Bill had reinforced the seal on all the bay's doors and vents. The only one allowed to go near it had been one of the senior tech priests. The cogboy had some ideas about chemical sprayers deployed by servo skulls, and Jim said he'd made some real progress. But the whole tech heresy thing had come up. Anyway, that's what the Space Marines had just landed in. A bay full of psychically active, highly caustic, and incredibly hard to remove warp fungus. Honestly, though, it was still only the third worst thing on the occurrence border they could have landed in. Our ship was definitely a little overdue for a tune-up. Through an absolutely heroic amount of persuasion, Doc and the Adepts managed to convince the Marines to abandon the bay. The second Marine, who identified himself as Sergeant Rebus, turned out to be very susceptible to logical arguments, and even helped talk Sergeant Gravis around before the fungus was able to melt through his boots. We still didn't forgive him for screwing up Sarge's initial attempt, though, because even if Gravis was going to be fine, he'd cycled his shuttle's airlock twice in the warp fungus bay. There was no way that bird wasn't contaminated as hell. We watched as not one, but two shuttles rose out of the bay. Neither of them looked anything like the Thunderhawks we'd expected when they'd told us we'd be working with Space Marines. Aside from being incredibly sleek, both of them were completely black, and only visible because our ship was acting as the backdrop. One of them was definitely having a little trouble flying in a straight line, though, and showed up as a faint ghost on the sensor tech's scopes. The other remained stubbornly invisible to all scanners as it settled in space in front of the bridge. The decontamination process was not fast. The sprayer skulls had to be found and refilled, the contaminated shuttle had to be completely voided, and a holding area had to be set up. On top of that, the whole time this was going on, Sergeant Gravis and his shuttle's crew were, as Tink put it, tripping balls. Given how heavily armed they were, the situation was very uncomfortable. But luckily, no one was killed and only one sprayer skull was destroyed. After hours of tedious cleaning, not to mention angry shouting about whose fault this all was, our team met with the Space Marines in the Occurrence Border's fanciest conference room. Our planning session was short, direct, and absolutely terrifying. Sergeant Gravis and Rebus of the Emperor's Scythe Space Marine chapter were not what you'd call socialites. In fact, they were even more aloof than the few Marines we'd previously met. They stomped up into the conference room, still wearing their power armor, and didn't even bother to remove their helmets. It was unnerving as hell talking to them, and even Sarge couldn't hold on to his inquisitorial dignity in the face of those stares. Rebus did most of the talking, and started by explaining that there were two main objectives and would be two separate teams. The first team would consist of him and his 4 scouts. The second would consist of Sergeant Gravis and his 2 scouts, one of which would be piloting the shuttle, plus Interrogator Sergeant and his 5 inquisitorial guardsmen. Sarge hesitantly asked if we'd need any support staff in the field. This triggered a look of terror from Jim, Hannah, and all of the Adepts, but Rebus said that they wouldn't be necessary. From the far end of the table, Fumbles held up his hand and asked if he was coming. The Marines considered this, then asked if he was capable of using his powers while simultaneously fending off the hive mind's continuous psychic assault. Fumbles quietly put his hand back down. After waiting a few seconds to see if anyone else would interrupt, Rebus started explaining what the two teams would be doing. Our team would go to the third planet in the system, then find and capture a zoanthrope. His team would destroy the hive ship orbiting it. Everyone in the room just sat there and stared at the Marines as Rebus started explaining the transportation situation and timeline. Tink managed to overcome his shock before anyone else, and loudly asked the Marines if they were insane/retarded. Amy and Nubby snickered, and Doc hastily clapped a hand over Tink's mouth. Sarge took a deep breath and asked Sergeant Rebus to explain why, and more importantly, how, the Marines were going to destroy an entire Tyranid hive ship. Rebus met Sarge's stare, and said his chapter's primary interest in the system was ensuring that the Tyranids did not overwhelm the Orcs and form a new splinter fleet. Capturing a live zoanthrope for the Inquisition was merely a side mission, a small favor to be completed when convenient. As for how, his team would board the hive ship and destroy it from within. Further details were not for those outside the chapter. All we needed to know was that the ship would die after we captured the zoanthrope, but before their psi suppressants could wear off and allow the hive mind to destroy the beast. As everyone digested this, Twitch broke his remarkably long silence. The demolitions trooper volunteered that the Marines probably had a vortex bomb, since an explosive would merely scatter still living pieces of ship across the planet, and a poison or virus would require a lot of sampling, plus a nearby laboratory. Both Marines glared at Twitch, who ignored them and went back to fiddling with the mine he was holding. After some more awkward silence, Sergeant Rebus went back to explaining the mission details. Both teams would deploy in his stealth shuttle, since the warp fungus had gotten into the control systems of Gravis. First, we'd insert his team on the hive ship, then go down to the planet and capture the zoanthrope. The occurrence border would follow us in on low power and stop at the edge of the hive ship's shadow, where it could easily warp out in an emergency. If our mission went quickly, we'd return to it and drop off our prize before the shuttle extracted Rebus's team. Otherwise, we'd pick them up on the way back. It slowly dawned on us that the Marines' plan called for us to sit, as helpless passengers, in a shuttle that would not only be carrying a notoriously unstable warp weapon, but would also be closing to boarding range with a hive ship. Even without the swarm of orc fighters attacking the ship, and the fact that we might be making a second visit while that warp weapon was actually armed, it sounded incredibly dangerous. With them, not to mention the whole capturing a Xenopsyker thing, it sounded downright suicidal. While the rest of us silently panicked, Doc hesitantly asked if it wouldn't make more sense to use both of the Marines' shuttles. Gravis, whose armor was sporting some truly impressive acid burns, glared at Doc and swore loud enough that we could hear him, despite the fact that he didn't have his helmet's speakers on. He bitterly suggested that we should have thought of that before neglecting the maintenance of our ship's shuttle bays, and then fell back into his sullen silence. Doc soldiered on despite his rebuttal, and asked whether the mission could be delayed until our tech priests fixed the fungus shuttle. Jim and Hannah made some panicked gestures, which seemed to imply that they had no idea how the stealth shuttle even worked, much less how to fix it. Rebus ignored them, gave Doc a simple no, and announced that the briefing was over. We'd be leaving as soon as his scouts finished transferring equipment to the shuttle, and Gravis's field repairs were completed. One of Gravis's scouts would deliver our mission-critical gear and explain the capture procedures to us in the meantime. With that, the two Marines stomped out. One by one, the engine seers, Adepts and fumbles followed them, leaving only us guardsmen sitting there, feeling like we'd lost all control of the situation.